The cold had teeth. Abner felt them in the marrow of his bones, a deep, gnawing ache that the fire could only hold at bay, never truly defeat. Flames licked at the frozen pine logs, spitting sparks into the immense, star-dusted darkness of the forest. The air was so still and frigid that each crackle of the wood sounded like a bone snapping. He sat hunched on a fallen log, nursing a tin cup of coffee that was more chicory than bean, the steam a fleeting ghost in the night. His horse, a sturdy roan, stood tethered nearby, its breath pluming in the icy air, its coat thick with the hardship of the season. He was a man comfortable with solitude, shaped by it, but tonight the silence felt heavier than usual, pressing in from the black wall of trees. He wasn't running from anything, not anymore. He was just moving through a world that had long since taught him the value of keeping to himself. The snap of a twig broke the quiet. It wasn't the sound of a deer or a coyote. It was hesitant, human. Abner's hand didn't go to the pistol at his hip. It simply rested on his thigh, a quiet readiness. He didn't move his head, only his eyes, scanning the edge of the firelight. A figure emerged from between two snow-laden spruces, more shadow than substance at first. Then the fire caught the details. A woman, slender and shivering, her face pale as bone china in the flickering light. She was dressed in a way he'd never seen up close, a high-collared gray dress of some soft, dark silk that seemed terribly unsuited for the wilderness. A single slash of color, a red scarf, was wrapped around her neck. Her black hair was coiled in an intricate knot, and her eyes, dark and wide, were fixed on the flames with a desperate, hungry longing. She held herself with a rigid dignity that seemed to be the only thing keeping her from collapsing. He watched her for a long moment, a ghost who had stepped out of the punishing cold. When she spoke, her voice was a fragile thread of sound, nearly lost to the night. "May I warm myself by your fire?" Abner looked from the woman's exhausted face to the dancing flames and back again. He saw the tremor in her hands, the faint blue tint to her lips. Fear was coiled tight in her posture, the expectation of refusal, of a harsh word or a violent dismissal. He'd seen that look before on the faces of the lost and the desperate. Most men would have seen a problem, a burden, or an opportunity for cruelty. Abner saw only the simple, brutal truth of the cold. He shifted on the log, making space, and gestured with his tin cup toward the fire. "It's a free fire, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "Made from wood that belongs to no man. Sit." The answer was so plain, so devoid of suspicion or demand, that it seemed to stun her more than a threat would have. Her dark eyes widened slightly, searching his face for the trick, the hidden price. He offered none. He simply turned his gaze back to the flames, giving her the space to make her own choice. For a full minute she remained frozen at the edge of the light, a statue of mistrust. The cold finally made the decision for her. She moved forward with a delicate, shuffling gait, her thin slippers crunching softly in the snow. She settled on the far side of the fire, as far from him as she could be while still feeling its heat. She tucked her hands into her sleeves, her shoulders hunched. Abner reached for the battered coffee pot sitting on a flat rock near the coals. Without a word, he poured a measure of the steaming black liquid into his only other cup, a dented, clean one he kept in his saddlebag. He leaned forward, extending it across the flames. "It'll warm your hands, if nothing else," he said. She flinched at the sudden movement, her eyes darting to his outstretched arm. She hesitated, then took the cup with both hands, her fingers wrapping around it as if it were a prayer. She didn't drink, just held it, letting the heat seep into her skin. He saw then that the silk of her dress was torn at the hem, and her slippers were soaked through and falling apart. This was not a woman equipped for this world. They sat in a silence broken only by the fire's hungry consumption of wood. He didn't ask her name or her business. Questions were a currency he rarely spent, and he knew they often came with a debt. He let the quiet be a blanket between them. He could feel her watching him, her gaze flickering from his weathered face to his calloused hands, trying to read the landscape of his character. He offered her nothing but stillness. He had a piece of jerky in his coat pocket and a hard biscuit in his saddlebag. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had. He pulled out the dried meat and held it out. "It's tough chewing," he warned, "but it's something." She looked at the food, then at him, and for the first time a flicker of something other than fear crossed her face. It was a profound, aching weariness. She took the jerky, her fingers brushing his for a half-second. Her touch was as cold as a winter stone. She ate slowly, methodically, as if forcing her body to remember the act of nourishment. The fire cast long, dancing shadows, making the forest around them seem both a sanctuary and a cage. He saw the exhaustion settling deeper into her, her eyelids drooping. The rigid posture was softening, melting with the heat and the small measure of food. He knew she wouldn't last the night out in the open, not in this cold. His camp was meager, a single bedroll and a heavy wool blanket. He looked at her, then at his bedroll, a silent calculation running through his mind. He had slept in worse conditions. He rose, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her, and fetched the thick blanket from his pack. He shook it out and, without ceremony, laid it over her shoulders. She stiffened, a sharp intake of breath, her body going rigid again. "Rest," he said, his voice flat, an order softened by an unspoken gentleness. "The ground is cold. The fire will last till morning." He then walked back to his log, sat down, and pulled his coat tighter, preparing to watch the fire and the woman until dawn. When morning came, a pale, reluctant light filtering through the dense canopy of pines, she was still asleep, curled under the blanket near the dying embers. Abner had not slept. He had fed the fire through the night, his vigil a silent, unacknowledged promise. He had his own ghosts, memories of times when a little warmth, a moment of unearned kindness, might have changed the course of a life. He watched her sleep, her face softened, the harsh lines of fear smoothed away for a few hours. The red scarf around her neck was a stark, vibrant wound against the gray of her dress and the white of the snow. He boiled the last of his coffee grounds, the familiar, bitter scent a small comfort in the biting air. When she stirred, her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the thin morning light. For a moment she looked disoriented, her gaze sweeping over the unfamiliar woods before landing on him. The fear returned instantly, a reflexive shuddering of her expression. She sat up, clutching the blanket around her. "I must go," she said, her voice husky with sleep. He nodded, offering her the cup of coffee. "Town's a day's ride north, Redemption Gulch. You'll find shelter there." He didn't ask if she was going there. He simply gave the information, a map offered without expectation. She took the coffee, her gaze dropping to the ground. She seemed to be wrestling with a decision. He packed his meager camp, saddled his horse, and prepared to leave. He expected she would vanish back into the trees as mysteriously as she had appeared. Instead, when he mounted his horse, she was standing, watching him, the blanket folded neatly on the log where she'd slept. He nudged his horse forward, not looking back. He rode for 10 minutes before a sound made him pause, the soft, rhythmic crunch of footsteps in the snow. He glanced over his shoulder. She was following, keeping a careful distance, her small figure a smudge of gray and red against the vast, white landscape. He slowed his horse to a walk, a silent concession. They traveled that way for hours, an unspoken, fragile truce between them. The world was a canvas of white and gray, the silence profound. Around noon, they came to an ice-choked creek, too wide to jump. He dismounted, leading his horse across a shallow, rocky section where the water churned sluggishly. He made it to the other side and turned, expecting her to find her own way. She stood at the edge, her ruined slippers no match for the frigid water. She looked at the creek, then up at the unforgiving mountains, her expression one of utter defeat. Abner sighed, a soft plume of white air. He tied his horse's reins to a low branch and walked back across the creek. He stopped in front of her. "I can carry you," he said, the words feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. She stared at him, her pride warring with the brutal reality of her situation. Before she could answer, he simply bent, scooped her into his arms, and carried her across the icy water as if she weighed nothing at all. He set her down on the dry bank, his touch lingering for only a second before he turned away, his face unreadable. They arrived in Redemption Gulch as dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the snow-covered peaks. It wasn't much of a town, just a single muddy street lined with a dozen false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a livery, and a boarding house. Smoke curled from stone chimneys, promising warmth and life within. Abner led his horse to the livery, the woman trailing behind him like a shadow. He paid the stablemaster for a stall and a rub-down for the roan, then turned to her. "The boarding house has rooms," he said, pointing a thumb toward a 2-story building with a sagging porch. "Mrs. Gable is a fair woman." She just nodded, her eyes taking in the town with a guarded, assessing gaze. She looked small and terribly out of place among the rough-hewn log buildings and the hardened faces of the few prospectors and trappers on the street. He walked her to the boarding house porch, the snow crunching under his boots. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "You'll be safe here," he said. It was more of a hope than a promise. She finally looked at him, truly looked at him, her gaze direct. "My name is Leanne," she said softly. It was the first piece of herself she had offered. "Abner," he replied. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and turned to leave, his business with her concluded. He had brought her to shelter. The rest was not his concern. But as he walked away, he found himself looking back, watching until the door of the boarding house closed behind her, swallowing her into the warmth and light. He rented a room for himself above the saloon, the noise and cheap whiskey smells a familiar kind of loneliness. The next day, he saw her. She was coming out of the town's small laundry, a steaming basket in her arms. She'd found work. He learned her story in pieces, not from her, but from the town's swift and brutal gossip mill. She was the widow of a merchant from a larger town to the east. When he died, his partner, a man named Davies, had produced documents claiming the business, the house, everything was his. He had offered Leanne protection, a veiled threat she had rightfully fled. She was a woman with nothing but the clothes on her back and a name that carried whispers of debt and scandal. Abner watched her from a distance. He saw the quiet dignity with which she worked, her hands, once soft, becoming red and raw from the hot water and harsh lye soap. He saw the way some of the townswomen looked at her, with a mixture of pity and suspicion. He started leaving things for her. A small sack of flour from the general store, left on the back step of the laundry before dawn. A pair of sturdy wool-lined boots he bought and left in the same spot a few days later, with no note. He never let her see him. They were offerings made to the silence, small acts of defiance against the coldness of the world. He was repairing a fence for the blacksmith, his hands busy but his mind elsewhere, when he heard a man's voice, loud and imperious, coming from the direction of the laundry. It was a voice that dripped with ownership. He dropped his hammer and walked, not ran, toward the sound. He saw a man in a fine wool coat and a derby hat standing over Leanne. He had her by the arm. This had to be Davies. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble, Leanne," the man was saying, his voice a sneer. "Did you think you could run from your obligations? From what you owe me?" Leanne's face was a mask of pale terror, but she did not cry out. She simply stood, rigid and defiant. Abner felt a slow, cold anger rise in him, an emotion he hadn't felt in years. He thought of her in the forest, shivering but unbroken. He thought of the quiet strength it took for her to survive. One evening, a week after Davy's arrival, Abner found her behind the laundry, sitting on an overturned bucket, her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. The fight had gone out of her. He didn't say a word, just walked over and sat on a nearby woodpile. The sun had set, and the air was growing sharp with the promise of a hard frost. He sat with her for a long time, the darkness gathering around them. He was a solid, quiet presence in the encroaching night. Finally, her sobs subsided. "He tells everyone I am a thief," she whispered to the ground. "He says my husband left me in his care, that I am his responsibility, his property." Abner picked up a small stone, turning it over and over in his calloused palm. "Some men," he said, his voice low and even, "think a piece of paper gives them the right to own a person's soul. They are wrong." She looked up, her eyes glistening in the faint moonlight. "The sheriff will not listen. Mr. Davies has money. He has letters." "He has lies," Abner corrected her gently. He stood up, towering over her for a moment. "You are not his property, Leanne. You are not his responsibility, and you will not be his shame." He looked toward the main street where the lights of the saloon cast a jaundiced glow. "This ends," he said, not to her but to the town itself. "Tomorrow." The next morning, Mr. Davies, emboldened by the sheriff's inaction and the town's wary neutrality, decided to force the issue. He found Leanne as she was crossing the street from the laundry to the general store. He was not subtle. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin. "Enough of this foolishness," he declared, his voice loud enough for the half-dozen people on the street to hear. "You are coming with me. We will settle your husband's debts, and then you will learn your place." People stopped. Windows were parted. This was the moment the town had been waiting for, the ugly drama playing out in the cold morning light. Leanne struggled, but his grip was like iron. Fear, stark and raw, was back on her face. And then Abner was there. He moved with a quiet economy, planting himself directly in Davy's path. He didn't touch him. He didn't raise his voice. He simply became an immovable object. "Let her go," Abner said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the air like honed steel. Davies sneered, his face flushing with anger. "This is none of your concern, drifter. This is a private matter." "You put your hands on her in the middle of the street," Abner replied, his eyes never leaving Davies. "It's everyone's concern now. Let her go." "She belongs with me. She is indebted," Davies shouted, trying to pull Leanne behind him. Abner took one slow step forward. He was not a large man, but he carried an aura of dense, unshakable solidity. "The only debt here is the one you owe for your cruelty," he said. "She owes you nothing. The shame is yours." From the door of his office, Sheriff Brody watched, his hand resting on the doorframe. He had seen Abner's quiet decency over the past weeks. He had seen Leanne's tireless work, and he saw the entitled aggression in Davies' eyes. It was then that Leanne found her voice. It was not loud, but it was clear and steady, forged in the fire of the last few weeks. "He is a liar," she said, pulling her arm free with a sudden, sharp twist. "My husband was an honest man. His ledgers were perfect. I believe Mr. Davies burned the real ones. He forged the papers he carries." The accusation, spoken with such conviction, hung in the cold air. Davies sputtered, his bluster failing him. The eyes of the town were on him now, not with curiosity, but with dawning judgment. Sheriff Brody pushed off the doorframe and walked slowly into the street. "Davies," the sheriff said, his voice weary but firm, "I think your business in Redemption Gulch is concluded. I suggest you be on your way before the ground thaws." Davies looked from the sheriff to Abner's unyielding face, and finally to Leanne, whose chin was held high. Defeated, he turned without another word and stalked toward the livery. Abner watched him go, then his gaze softened as he looked at Leanne. He gently took her hand, turning it over to examine the red marks on her wrist. He held it for a moment longer than necessary, a silent promise of safety finally fulfilled. The winter broke. The oppressive weight of the snow and cold began to lift, replaced by the smell of damp earth and the hesitant song of returning birds. The ice on the creek cracked and flowed away, and the town of Redemption Gulch seemed to exhale. With Davies gone, a quiet peace settled over Leanne. The suspicion in the townspeople's eyes was replaced by a grudging respect. She continued her work at the laundry, but now she walked with her head held high, a woman who had faced down her ghost and won. Abner stayed. He took on odd jobs, mending fences, breaking a wild colt for the livery, reinforcing the roof of the general store. He worked with a steady, tireless rhythm. He and Leanne fell into a comfortable pattern. Most evenings he would appear at the back of the laundry as she was finishing her work. He would bring her something, a warm pastry from the baker, a handful of early spring wildflowers he'd found growing near the creek. They would sit on the back steps, not always talking, just sharing the quiet space as the day ended. The silence between them was no longer tense or wary. It was a soft, comfortable thing, woven from shared hardship and mutual respect. One evening she touched the back of his hand. "Why did you help me, Abner?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked out at the darkening line of the mountains. "Because no one should have to be that cold," he answered simply. He meant the night in the forest, but he also meant something more, something deeper. She understood. Their connection wasn't built on grand declarations, but on small, repeated acts of care. A shared cup of coffee, a warm blanket, a pair of dry boots, an immovable presence in a muddy street. It was a love that had grown slowly, like a stubborn mountain flower pushing its way through frozen ground, its roots deep and strong. Abner had been saving his pay. He didn't spend it on whiskey or cards. One day he bought a small, neglected plot of land a mile outside of town. It had a dilapidated one-room cabin and a field overgrown with weeds, but it backed onto the creek and had a clear view of the sunrise over the peaks. He spent every spare hour there, working. He replaced the rotten logs of the cabin, chinked the walls with fresh mud and straw, and built a new stone fireplace, checking the draw until it pulled perfectly. He mended the sagging fence and cleared a small patch of ground for a garden. He was not just building a shelter, he was building a place to stand still. When the work was done, he went to find Leanne. It was a Sunday, her one day of rest. He found her by the creek, washing her hair, the long black strands shimmering in the sun. "I have something to show you," he said. She followed him, her curiosity piqued. He led her up the path to the small piece of land. She saw the cabin, sturdy and clean, with a curl of smoke rising from its new chimney. A simple wooden bench sat on the small porch he'd built. The field was cleared, the dark soil turned and ready for planting. He didn't look at her. He looked at the cabin, his hands in his pockets. "It's not much," he said, his voice quiet, "but the roof is sound, and the fire draws true." He paused, gathering his words carefully. "There's 2 rooms inside now. One is a kitchen. The other is just a room." He finally turned to face her, and his eyes were full of a deep, earnest vulnerability. "A fire will burn all winter," he continued softly, "and no one will ever tell you where you belong again, because this could be it, if you want it." It was not a question of marriage, not in words. It was an offering of a life, of a home, of a future built with his own 2 hands, offered to her with an open heart. Leanne looked from his sincere, weathered face to the little cabin that stood as a testament to his quiet, steady care. She saw not just wood and stone, but safety, dignity, and a place to finally, truly rest. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. She stepped forward and gently placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "Yes, Abner," she whispered. "Yes."